So here we are at the fourth of our supergroups, the fourth supergroup off of the domain Eukarya. Finally, we're to a supergroup that contains something more than just protists. We're talking about the supergroup Archaeoplastida. This supergroup includes red algae and green algae, which are types of protists, but it also includes the land plants that we're more familiar with. The Archaeoplastida first began over 1 billion years ago when a heterotrophic protist acquired a cyanobacterial endosymbiont, and then the photosynthetic descendants of this ancient protist eventually evolved into the lineage that we know of as red algae and green algae, and then from the green algae lineage that eventually led to an offshoot that we now know as land plants. So again, this idea of endosymbiosis is very important to the protist group and then eventually to other groups such as land plants that we know very well today. So we're going to look at red algae and green algae, in particular one variety of the green algae, and that will be our examples for Archaeoplastida. So here we are. We've already looked at 3 different supergroups that contain nothing but protists. In our fourth supergroup, we have a mixture of protists plus the land plants that we're more familiar with. We're going to start with the protist red algae. Red algae, of course, get their name from their coloration from various pigments. They do contain chlorophyll, but a lot of times you don't really see much of that. It gets masked or covered up by accessory pigments, such as phycoerythrin, which is the reddish pigment that gives it its color. The color will vary depending on where the red algae lives. If it lives in more shallow waters of the ocean, the color of the red algae will be kind of a greenish red, and then as you go into deeper and deeper water, it turns to a darker red and almost to a black color in the very deep waters. And that's because different pigments will be best at receiving different wavelengths of light, and the depth of the water will determine what wavelength of light can get down to that particular depth. So they're adapted to try to gain as much light as they can using different colors of pigments. The red algae are usually multicellular. A lot of times they kind of look like different types of plants that you might see, and the largest of them are what we commonly call seaweeds. The red algae are the most abundant large algae in coastal waters of the tropic areas of the earth. Here's some pictures of some examples of the red algae. Again, very plant-like features. They look very plant-like. This one looks kind of like a red version of some sort of lettuce. Here's one called nori that you might be familiar with. Here it is being grown on basically an ocean farm. It's grown on this netting. Then it's dried, and then it can be used for processing, like for example for wrapping sushi. So some of the seaweed wrap that you might have on your sushi roll is a good example of red algae. They also use other forms of algae for the sushi wraps, but nori is a common one. Moving over to talk about our green algae. The green algae also are named for their coloration. They're grass green chloroplasts. These are basically the lineage that eventually led to the land plants that we know, such as oak trees and rose bushes and that type of thing. Green algae are a paraphyletic group, which means the taxa contains the common ancestor but not all of the descendants. The 2 main groups within the green algae are called the chlorophytes and the charophyceans. The charophyceans or charophytes are very closely related to the land plants, so we're actually going to wait and discuss them in chapter 29 when we talk about land plants. So for the moment of the green algae, we're going to talk about the chlorophytes and look at some examples. Most of the chlorophytes live in freshwater, although there are some that live in the oceans. Other chlorophytes live not necessarily directly in the water, but in damp soil or as symbionts with lichens or even in snow. So again, there's a huge variety of protists, and the conditions they live under is quite wide as well. Larger size and greater complexity evolved in chlorophytes by 3 different ways. Either through the formation of colonies from individual cells, and if you take a look inside the Chapter 28 folder, you might find a video for Volvox. Volvox is a good example of a single-celled creatures that work together as a colony, and I think I might have a video or 2 of the Volvox. So that's a green algae that's a single-celled green algae, but usually multiple of them group together and kind of cooperate to form almost like a larger organism made up of singular cells. The other way that chlorophytes have developed larger size and complexity is by the formation of multicellular bodies by cell division and differentiation. So this would be more like a true multicellular creature, and that would be like the sea lettuce that you see here, the ulva. So it has made up of multiple cells, and some of those cells are differentiated. They do different jobs. And then the last one is a repeated division of nuclei with no cytoplasmic division. So this would be basically like one large cell with numerous nuclei, but the cell doesn't complete the division and separate into two cytoplasmic parts. There's no pinching in the middle and separating into two portions. So it's kind of like one cell that divides and repeats and reproduces more of the inside portion, but doesn't subdivide into separate cells. And this plant is kind of an example of what you might see for that type of chlorophyte. So a couple different ways that this type of green algae has grown in size and complexity, and I have a few examples here. Most of the green algae chlorophytes have pretty complex life cycles that involve a mixture of sexual and asexual reproductive stages. So there's a combination of parts of their life that involve fertilization and meiosis, and then there's another part that forms spores. That's an asexual reproductive part. So it's a little bit more complex than, say, a basic animal like a mammal or something to that effect. Alright, that's it for the Archaea plastida. Some good examples in there: red algae, green algae, and then of course we'll talk about the land plants later on, but all of those fall within this supergroup called Archaea plastida.